They broke his hands and promised to be on their way by sunrise, but Jedrick smiled through the pain and said he would be back before the stew cooled, and that night the hills answered with the sound of a bear that had learned war. Jedrick had always believed the sky was mostly polite, dependable as a milk cow, good for rain when the almanac said and quiet when his potatoes needed sun. He rose before the twin suns most mornings, cranky in a way that comforted his neighbors, because a cranky man who tends his rows and gives away half his honey at the church table is the closest thing a town gets to a compass. On the day everything changed, he was arguing with a scarecrow that refused to hold its hat in a proper tilt, a debate Jedrick conducted in the dignified grumble of one who has nothing left to prove. He had a plan for the harvest fair. He would win on potatoes, place on hogs, and steal applause with a jar of the fermented honey he had been coaxing along in the shadow of the south fence. Life, as he liked to declare to the hens, was about small victories that fit in your pocket. The first sound was not thunder. It was a bass line that turned the corn to metronomes and made his teeth buzz like a cheap fiddle. Jedrick looked up and saw lights threading through cloud like drunk fireflies, weaving patterns that would have delighted a sober congregation and horrified the old choir mistress. The younger folks in town had said a traveling circus was due, that artists from off-world would juggle and sing, and that someone had invented gravity balloons so a child could bounce to the first star and come back trailing sparks. Jedrick had an opinion on gravity balloons, and it was not generous. He had more respect for a fence post that knew its duty. The ships arrived without grace. One drifted too low and shaved the top of the poplars. Another tried to settle by the pigpen and discovered that pigs have opinions on the rights of airships. The largest ship thumped into the field and crushed the neatest row of potatoes Jedrick had ever made. He walked to the wrecked earth and counted silently, a habit his mother had taught him for moments when words turned to knives. He reached 27. At 28 the ship door sighed open and a ramp slid down like a tongue. What stepped out could have passed for gracious if not for the boots that left wet burn marks in the dirt. The alien wore a white coat and a lavender sash, and carried a case that clicked politely when set on the ground. He bowed with cultured precision and introduced himself as Cracks, licensed contractor of acquisition initiatives, currently tasked with the collection of livestock, unpaid taxes, and interesting locals. Jedrick offered him nothing except the knowledge that a man who stands in another man's potatoes owes an apology before business. Cracks attempted one. It came out as an essay on regional agronomy and the challenges of landing protocols under festive light. Behind Cracks a half-dozen beings fanned out with scanners and unlabeled enthusiasm. They treated the farm like a museum, and the animals like unwilling docents. One of them tried to skin the hens and received a lecture in clucking that translated well enough into any language. Another poked the beehives and regretted it with the universal clarity of being stung. Jedrick watched, arms folded tight to hide the tremble of rage, and asked for their warrant, their badge numbers, their nearest mayor. Cracks smiled with immaculate teeth and said this was not a criminal matter but a logistics exercise, and that courtesy was being extended in the form of not vaporizing the barn. Jedrick lifted the jar of fermented honey he had brought for show and for luck. He told Cracks that men who use courtesy to threaten are like goats in suits, and that both should be shooed from decent porches. Cracks nodded as if receiving a poem and took one idle step forward. He spoke a phrase in a language that moved like velvet over knives, and two of his crew stepped behind Jedrick and took his wrists. The jar fell and landed unbroken in the dirt, a small mercy that Jedrick would remember later with rage and gratitude mixed in one cup. Cracks sighed and told him not to be a martyr because it was a messy roll, then reached out and pressed precisely along each of Jedrick's hands as if tuning a harp. The pain arrived without dignity and made a room inside his skull where every breath echoed. Jedrick was no stranger to hurt. He had ridden bulls in his youth, and he had cut a barbed wire that sang through his palm like a violin, but the new pain was a map of bones that had forgotten their addresses. He would remember the moment in fragments. The whimper he swallowed because he would not give Cracks a full cry. The smell of scorched grass around the ship. The comforting shock of bees rising as a cloud to protest their own treatment, as if the farm itself had a voice and was yelling at the invaders to mind their manners. Cracks apologized again. He apologized with 2 languages and a bow that belonged in a ballroom. He explained that this was a temporary disability meant to reduce the likelihood of resistance, and that the crew would be efficient. They would take 6 pigs, 12 hens, half the honey stores, and the tractor if it could be condensed to fit in the ship. Jedrick managed to ask why a man who said please would break another man's hands. Cracks answered that politeness lubricates civilization, and that sometimes one must oil the gears firmly. He offered Jedrick a voucher for the damage and a recommendation to spend it on rest. Jedrick thought of throwing his stump of a pane at Cracks and instead stood still like a post, because a post is what keeps a fence true. Neighbors came to the edge of the road then, peering from behind peach trees and parked wagons. They were good people with long memories and practical shoes. They murmured about calling the sheriff, about writing to the delegate, about how this was not right. Some argued that one farmer against a ship of slavers is a poor equation. Others said that cattle thieves are still thieves if they use light shows and long words. Jedrick listened to them without moving, because moving made his hands feel like hot stones. He told them to go home and lock their doors and not to spend their courage foolishly. He would handle this farm because it was his. He would do it tonight because the stew would be done by sundown, and he liked his supper hot. The crew worked through the afternoon, cataloging as if they meant to send a thank you note. They dragged away squealing pigs and offended hens and the big blue barrel of honey that Jedrick had planned to open at the fair. They even tried to coax the tractor, which refused to start out of pure spite and perhaps a hint of patriotism. Cracks walked the rows with a connoisseur's gaze, complimenting the straightness of the furrows and the subtle care in the irrigation ditches. He suggested that Jedrick consider a future in landscaping once his recovery permitted. Jedrick told him that men who steal and flatter in the same breath are a hazard to grammar and must be removed from polite conversation. Jedrick had never been the sort to put faith in tavern tales, but the war bear was different. It was a story so old the hills themselves seemed to hum it when the wind ran in certain directions. Men with more brawn than sense claimed to have glimpsed it, always from a safe distance, and always while running the opposite way. Some said the bear was the size of a wagon and armored in scars that looked like maps of places no one had visited. Others insisted it could speak, though in what language no one could agree. Jedrick had grown up listening to those yarns while shelling peas with his father, shaking his head at the embellishments. Yet here he was, walking toward the south ridge with hands that hung useless at his sides, thinking that if ever a man needed a myth to be true, this was the time. The path was stubborn and rocky, just like its traveler. Each step was a trial, because climbing with broken hands meant every slip threatened to jar him into a fresh wave of pain. He had tied his supplies awkwardly with his elbows and teeth, muttering curses at the knots when they held too well or too loosely. His lantern swung from his shoulder, thumping against his ribs in a rhythm that almost matched his breathing. The suns were sliding toward the horizon, staining the slopes in molten colors that promised night would come faster than he liked. He kept walking, knowing the caves were best approached before darkness swallowed the ridges whole. Halfway up the climb, Jedrick stopped at a small spring to catch his breath. He bent down, scooped water awkwardly with his forearms, and sipped. It tasted of minerals and old stone, sharp enough to wake him from the ache in his bones. A rabbit darted across the path, froze, and regarded him with the sort of suspicion usually reserved for foxes. He thought of the animal stolen from his farm and felt a rush of heat in his chest that had nothing to do with the climb. If the bear was real, it was the only creature in these hills big enough to even the score against those slavers. The caves began with an opening wide enough to welcome a caravan. The stone walls were painted with moss and old soot, and the air was cool and damp in a way that suggested it had never cared much for the world outside. Jedrick stepped inside, careful where his boots landed, each footfall echoing back at him in strange, stretched tones. There were markings along the walls, carved and scratched by hands human and not. Some looked like warnings, others like boasts from travelers who thought surviving here made them legendary. One said, in letters deep enough to last another 100 years, "Here lies Kevbad with bears." Jedrick felt a shiver crawl up his spine, though he told himself it was only the draft. The deeper he went, the more the cave swallowed light. His lantern cast a flickering halo that revealed narrow tunnels twisting in different directions, some sloping up, others down. The air smelled of damp fir, stone, and something sweeter that he could not place. It was in the third chamber, where the floor dipped into a pool of water black as ink, that he first heard it, a low, rumbling sound like distant thunder. The hairs on his arms lifted. He froze, straining to tell if it was behind him or ahead. Then it came again, closer, and this time he recognized it as the rolling growl of something alive. Jedrick followed the sound through a tunnel so low he had to stoop, his back brushing against the rock above. He emerged into a cavern vast enough to hold a farmhouse, its ceiling hung with jagged crystals that caught his lantern's light and scattered it like stars. And there, at the far end, sprawled on a bed of broken stone, was the war bear. She was enormous, her fur a patchwork of gray and black, her muzzle lined with scars that gave her face a permanent scowl. One ear was notched, the other twitched at his presence. Her eyes opened, gold in the gloom, and fixed on him with the lazy interest of a predator deciding if the thing in front of it was worth the trouble. Every instinct in Jedrick's body told him to run. His legs felt the urge before his mind could deny it. But he stood his ground, because he had come here with nothing left to bargain but his will. He opened the sack at his feet and used his forearms to bring out the jar of fermented honey. Its lid was wax tight, the glass sweating with the coolness of the cave. The bear's nostrils flared, and for the first time her growl changed, softened into something almost curious. Jedrick rolled the jar toward her, watching it bump across the uneven stone until it stopped just shy of her paw. She sniffed it once, twice, then lifted the jar delicately in claws the length of carving knives. With a single swipe she cracked it open, and the smell of the honey poured out into the cave like a summer afternoon. She lapped it up in slow, deliberate swipes of her tongue, the growl fading into a sound that might have been satisfaction. When the jar was empty, she set it aside and looked back at him. Her mouth opened and, to Jedrick's surprise, words stumbled out. Not clear words, not in any language he recognized cleanly, but enough to understand tone. It was an insult, delivered with the blunt authority of someone accustomed to speaking their mind. Jedrick let out a short laugh, half in disbelief, half because the absurdity kept him from trembling. The bear tilted her head, then repeated something else, this time closer to a question. He stepped forward, slow enough to show he was no threat, and told her about the slavers, about the pigs and hens and the blue honey barrel. He told her about the man in the lavender sash, and the way he smiled while breaking bones. The bear listened, her ears twitching at certain words, her eyes narrowing at others. When he finished, she huffed, a sound that carried weight, and rose to her full height. Up close, the war bear was a wall of fur and muscle that blocked out the lantern light. She stepped around him once, sniffing, her breath warm on his neck. Then she spoke again, this time in a rough approximation of his language. The words were blunt but understandable. She asked what he would give for her help. Jedrick told her the truth, everything he had left. The rest of the honey, the comfort of a warm shed if she wanted it, and the chance to make those slavers regret every step they took on his farm. The bear's mouth curled into something that was not quite a smile but close enough to count. She nodded, a short, sharp motion, and said she would come. She also said her name was Buga, and that she had her own reasons for wanting the one called cracks. Jedrick didn't ask what they were, not yet. He just felt the first flicker of hope since the moment the ship had landed in his field. Together, they turned toward the mouth of the cave, the sound of her heavy paws echoing beside his footsteps. Outside, the last of the light was fading, and in its place the dark rose like a curtain, ready for the next act. Buga was not the sort of companion a man could take home without warning the neighbors. Even in the shadowy light of the cave, she seemed too large for the world he knew. Standing beside her was like walking next to a boulder that decided to grow fur and a bad temper. Jedrick followed her deeper into the tunnels, his lantern swaying and throwing long, broken shadows along the jagged walls. Her paw steps were slow but heavy, each one echoing through the stone like a drumbeat that kept time for his aching body. His broken hands throbbed with every jolt of his boots on the rock, but the pain was almost welcome. It reminded him this was not a fever dream and that the bear at his side was real, her musky scent clinging to the damp air. When the cave widened into a chamber that smelled faintly of smoke and old battles, Buga stopped and sat on her haunches. She watched him with those sharp gold eyes, head tilting slightly as if studying a new tool. In the center of the chamber was a pit lined with blackened stones, the remnants of a fire long burned out. Around the edges were bones, some small enough to be from rabbits, others large enough to belong to creatures Jedrick could not name. His boots crunched on gravel as he stepped closer, keeping his movements slow. The air was warmer here, and a faint trickle of water dripped from the ceiling into a shallow bowl carved into the rock. Buga spoke again, her words still rough but clearer now. She asked him if he had ever fought without hands. Jedrick let out a short, humorless laugh and said he had never planned to fight without them, but life had a habit of ignoring plans. She huffed, a sound between amusement and dismissal, then rose and motioned with a jerk of her head for him to follow her to an open patch of stone floor. There she began to move, lowering her massive frame into a series of slow, deliberate sways and lunges, like a boulder teaching itself to dance. She growled instructions that he understood more by watching than listening, and he tried to copy her motions, his balance awkward and his boots slipping on the grit. It was absurd, a farmer with bandaged hands attempting to mimic a war bear's fighting stance, but Jedrick forced himself through it. He learned how to shift his weight from hip to shoulder so he could throw his whole body into a strike, even without fists. Buga corrected him by batting him with her paw, sending him stumbling until his boots caught on the uneven floor. Each correction came without gentleness, but not with cruelty either. By the third round, sweat streaked down his back and his breathing came in sharp bursts. His ribs ached from the effort, but his movements began to match hers, clumsy but purposeful. After the training, Buga lumbered over to a narrow alcove in the wall. She dug out a bundle wrapped in animal hide and dropped it at his feet. Inside were strips of dried meat, pungent herbs, and a small flask filled with something that smelled strong enough to burn the inside of a man's nose. She explained in her clipped way that the slavers had a weakness for certain scents, fermented ones that could cloud their senses and make their balance falter. Jedrick listened closely, picturing Crax's perfect posture and imagining it broken under the haze of that smell. As they ate in silence, Jedrick noticed Buga kept glancing at a scar that ran along her side, a deep furrow where the fur refused to grow back. It was an old wound but healed poorly, the skin puckered like a seam pulled too tight. He asked her about it, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then she told him, in halting words, that Crax had once hunted her, not for sport but for a bounty placed on her head by creatures she would not name. She had escaped, but not before learning the sting of his weapons. That was why she had listened to Jedrick at all. She had her own debt to settle. The more they spoke, the more he began to see the shape of their alliance. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was an agreement forged in the same heat, two stubborn creatures unwilling to let someone else write the ending of their story. He told her about the farm in greater detail, describing the layout, the slope of the fields, the places where the fences were strong and where they sagged. She listened, occasionally interrupting to ask how wide a gate was or how deep a ditch ran. Her mind was mapping the land, shaping it into a battlefield. When they finished eating, Buga rose again and padded toward the cave entrance. She did not look back to see if he followed, but he did, his legs still unsteady from the training. The night air hit him as they emerged, cool and sharp with the scent of pine and distant rain. The ridge stretched out before them, and far below he could see the faint scatter of lanterns from the town. He thought of his neighbors, probably asleep or pretending to be while worrying about what the slavers might take next. He thought of the empty pigpen, the silent henhouse, the crushed potato rows. Buga stopped at the edge of the slope, her head lifting as if scenting something far away. She told him they would need more than anger to win. They would need traps, distractions, and a way to keep the slavers from calling in help. Jedrick felt a reluctant grin tug at his mouth. Planning was something he understood, whether for planting crops or protecting them. He began to speak aloud, shaping a plan as they stood there in the moonlight. Honey could be used as bait and as a weapon, thick enough to slow the slavers and coated with herbs to overwhelm their senses. The fences could be rigged to collapse under the weight of anything heavy enough to chase him. The barn loft could hide a surprise that dropped from above. Buga listened, occasionally adding a suggestion that involved more claws and more smashing. She was less concerned with subtlety and more with impact, but Jedrick could see where their approaches might meet in the middle. He told her they would need to move by tomorrow night, before Cracks had time to sell what he'd stolen or bring reinforcements. She agreed, though she reminded him that if he slowed her down, she would not carry him. It was not meant as a threat, merely a fact. They began the descent back toward the farm, moving carefully over the loose rocks and narrow trails. The moonlight caught in Buga's fur, outlining her in silver. Jedrick found himself glancing at her more than once, still not quite able to believe she was walking beside him. He had set out that afternoon with broken hands and no plan but to confront a legend, and now he had an ally who could tear through a ship's hull if she put her weight into it. The pain in his hands was still sharp, but it no longer felt like the thing that defined him. By the time they reached the lower slopes, the first hints of dawn were painting the sky in pale colors. The farm lay ahead, quiet in the early light. Jedrick could almost imagine it whole again, but the sight of the damaged field brought the truth back like a slap. Buga growled low in her throat, a sound that matched his own unspoken anger. They crossed the last stretch in silence, each step a promise that what had been taken would be returned, and that Crax's polished manners would not shield him when the bear came to call. By the time Jedrick and Buga reached the fence line, the morning had peeled itself into a clear blue slice, and the farm sat under it like a patient with a brave face. The pigs were gone, the hens quiet as a kept secret, and the neat rows where potatoes should have stood were stamped by thrust or scorch, and the wandering heel prints of polite thieves. Jedrick paused at the gate, and felt his lungs fill with air and ache and everything that made a man remember why he stood upright. Buga sniffed the wind and rumbled a few blunt observations about alien scents, rotten sugar, and fear, then padded to the barn with a deliberate swagger that would have caused sensible wolves to write apologies. Jedrick followed, his hands burning with each step, and set his jaw in the way a plow sets when it decides a field is going to cooperate whether it wants to or not. Work began with small humiliations and stubborn victories. Jedrick could not tie a proper knot, so he learned to anchor rope with his knees and teeth and the weight of his back, wedging cord around posts until the lines thrummed tight. Buga hauled and lifted as if gravity had been served a notice of eviction, dragging barrels, timber, and the dented old honey press from behind the shed. They inventoried the supplies with the grim efficiency of a siege cook. There was one intact blue barrel of fermented honey hidden beneath a tarp behind the feed sacks, 5 smaller jars with waxed lids, 2 rolls of fencing wire, a crate of kitchen salt, a bag of pepper hot enough to convince a mule to confess, and a box of fireworks left over from a harvest fair that had ended with a singed mayor. Jedrick eyed the fireworks and murmured that if the mayor asked later he would tell him the truth, which was almost the same as permission. They set the first trap in the north field where the ground dipped and collected the kind of mud that looked innocent but kept grudges. Jedrick and Buga poured a ribbon of honey along a shallow trench and stirred in crushed herbs until the air over the ditch smelled like a bakery at war. He mixed in the pepper and the kitchen salt, remembering Buga's lesson about slaver biology, and how fermented scents knock their balance askew. For good measure he draped thin latticework of wire over the trench, held up by sticks that would snap under a careless boot. Above, hidden beneath the ragged quilt of the old scarecrow cloak, he layered the fireworks and ran a fuse back to the barn loft. Buga watched with skeptical interest and added her contribution by dragging a wagon wheel into place so that when the wires gave, the wheel would tilt and catapult a sticky barrel onto whoever was unfortunate enough to find themselves in exactly the wrong place. Jedrick observed that farming had always been about timing and gravity, only today the harvest would be shrieks. In the yard he turned the chicken run into a funnel, leaving the gate ajar and baiting the path with a line of cracked corn soaked in honey. The plan was not subtle, but it did not need to be. Slavers loved corridors, schedules, and confidence. Buga anchored a heavy beam across the top of the barn doors and looped rope over it in a sling, the rope ends tied to a half-full barrel of honey. When the doors were pulled fast, the barrel would swing like a sweet-tempered wrecking ball. Jedrick could not test the knots with his hands, so he used his shoulder and the stubbornness that kept fence posts straight in clay soil. The rope held. The barrel swayed and the beam groaned, and Buga gave a grunt that meant approval in several species. They stopped once, not to rest but to swallow water and remind their bodies that living was still happening. Jedrick looked toward the road and saw dust, the kind that is raised by more than one set of wheels. Buga tilted her head and tasted the air again. She said in her clipped way that the aliens were coming sooner than expected and in greater number, the scent of their engines sharp as vinegar burned on a pan. Jedrick felt a quick spark of joy at the confirmation that he had judged Cracks correctly. A man who breaks bones with a smile is a man who mistakes patience for weakness. He thanked the scarecrow for its service and set it atop the barn loft hatch as a decoy silhouette. Then he limped to the porch and placed 3 jars in plain sight like a farmer spreading jam for unexpected company. The first ship arrived with more dignity than the last time, as if Cracks wanted to demonstrate that one can crush a man's livelihood with ceremony. It hovered, preened, and settled in a clean line parallel to the ruined potato row. The ramp unfurled and Cracks emerged in his careful sash, flanked by crew with scanners and the kind of helmets that claim they are for safety when they are really for intimidation. He called across the yard in that smooth voice and announced a follow-up inspection for compliance and the retrieval of outstanding inventory. Jedrick walked down the steps and smiled with sufficient teeth to cause mild alarm. He said that the inventory had changed since yesterday and that today's special was sticky regret with a garnish of bad luck. Cracks looked genuinely pleased with the phrasing and said he would add it to a speech someday. When Cracks stepped forward, the honey barrel above the barn doors swung. The rope whined and the barrel sighed through the space where he had been a heartbeat earlier. He moved with infuriating grace and the barrel smashed into the ground beside him, exploding into a tide that soaked boots, hems, and the ankles of the first 4 crew. It was not elegant, but it was exuberant. The air filled with the ripe ferment of summer trapped in amber, laced with the herbs and pepper. Several crew staggered, their balance gone as if the ground had developed a hobby. The second ship was circling into land when Buga hit the first one. She did not roar so much as announce herself with a sound that made the barn nails tremble. Then she leaped, all muscle and momentum, and tore into the nearest hull with a slash that peeled metal like bark. Chaos spread the way it always does when plans meet living opponents. 2 crew dashed for the chicken run and found themselves guided along the funnel by a precise rain of Jedrick's insults. They charged, boots sucking at mud, and stepped onto the wire lattice. Sticks snapped. The hidden trench drank them up to the knees in honey, the pepper fumes hit them like a slap, and the wagon wheel sprang, flipping the half-barrel onto their shoulders in a sticky crown that would have made a beekeeper nostalgic. Jedrick lit the fuse that ran to the loft. Fire crept like a bright worm into the fireworks. The first rocket screamed into the sky, then burst not into colors but into thunder and smoke, a curtain that turned the farm into a stage without sidelines. Cracks remained a cool column in the hurricane. He signaled crisply and 2 more ships angled in, their floodlights washing the fields white. He stepped around the honey splash with nimble disdain and admired the traps as one might admire an amateur quilt. He congratulated Jedrick on the creativity, and then raised a hand-sized device to his mouth. Buga saw the motion and charged, but a column of force snapped up from the device that shoved her sideways with a crack of air. She rolled, shook her head, and came up angrier, which did not improve the future health of the nearest hull. The flagship's corridors were wide enough to drive a wagon through and so polished that Jedrick could see the reflection of his own tired eyes in the floor as he walked. The air was crisp, recycled with the faint metallic tang of a place that had never smelled dirt or hay. Cracks led him through in silence, the only sound the soft hiss of the ship's systems and the distant thrum of engines working like an unseen heartbeat. Jedrick kept his head up, studying everything, the angles of the doors, the seams in the panels, the pattern of lights on the ceiling, because a man who doesn't plan an escape the moment he's caught has already surrendered. He noticed cameras in the corners, little blinking eyes that followed his steps, and 2 guards in matching armor that trailed a careful 3 paces behind. They stopped in a room that felt both like a drawing room and a cage. The walls were smooth panels, each with faint patterns that might have been art or might have been schematics for the unlucky. A low table sat in the center, bearing a carafe of something that steamed faintly and a tray of pale bread. Cracks gestured to a chair with the same courtesy one might use to offer a coat. Jedrick looked at the chair, then at his useless hands, and lowered himself into it slowly, refusing to wince where Cracks could see. Cracks poured the steaming drink into a cup and set it in front of him, speaking of hospitality and civilized discussion as if the past day had been a misunderstanding over grazing rights. Jedrick asked where they were keeping Buga. Cracks smiled thinly and said she was being accommodated in a secure containment module, and that such creatures were dangerous if allowed to roam unsupervised. Jedrick told him that so were farmers. Cracks chuckled, a sound without warmth, and leaned forward. He said he admired ingenuity, that the traps on the farm had been inventive for someone of limited resources, and that perhaps Jedrick's talents could be put to better use. He spoke of work, of alliances, of the profit to be made if one knew when to bend and when to stand straight. Jedrick listened, nodding at the right moments, his mind already turning each word over like a stone to see if there was anything hidden underneath. The conversation was interrupted by a faint shudder through the floor. Cracks glanced toward the door, irritation flickering across his face before he masked it again. He tapped something on the table and a panel slid open to reveal a small display. On it, Jedrick caught a glimpse of the farm from high above, the floodlights still trained on the barn, the smoke from spent fireworks drifting in lazy curls. Neighbors were still there, clustered near the fence line, their figures tiny from this height. Some of them waved tools in defiance toward the hovering smaller ships. Jedrick felt a rush of something close to pride that they were holding their ground, even without him. Cracks closed the display and stood. He said the time for negotiation was short, and that he would show Jedrick something that might change his mind. They walked again, this time down a narrower corridor lined with doors that hummed faintly, each one likely holding something best kept inside. At the far end was a larger door guarded by two slavers with weapons resting casually in their hands. Cracks entered a code, and the door slid open to reveal a wide chamber glowing with the cold light of containment fields. In the center hung the cage of light holding Buga, suspended above the floor by arcs of energy that pulsed in slow rhythm. She was pacing in tight circles, her claws scraping against nothing, her eyes burning gold in the glare. Jedrick stepped closer until the heat of the containment field prickled against his skin. Buga stopped pacing and fixed him with a look that held both accusation and trust. He told her quietly that he was here to get her out, that she needed to wait until he gave her the signal. Cracks stood behind him, speaking in a voice smooth enough to slip between stones, explaining how the containment field worked, how it would hold even the strongest creature without harm but without escape. Jedrick listened with half an ear, his mind focused on the pattern of the pulses, the location of the emitters, the faint scent in the air that suggested the system ran hot under strain. Cracks stepped closer to the cage and addressed Buga directly, offering her the chance to be transported to a hunting preserve where she could live in comfort, her days filled with easy prey and no more battles. Buga's only answer was a low, rolling growl that made the containment field flicker for a heartbeat. Crax's smile tightened. He gestured for Jedrick to follow him out, and they left the chamber with the hum of the field fading behind them. Once they were back in the corridor, Crax told him to think carefully about the offers on the table, because choices made in haste tended to shorten a man's life. They returned to the drawing-room-like space, but the moment they stepped inside, the ship gave another, stronger shudder. This time it was followed by the faint wail of an alarm, not loud but persistent. Crax tapped the display again, and a schematic of the ship unfolded in midair, sections flashing in yellow. He frowned, murmured something about interference, and left the room with one of the guards, ordering the other to stay with Jedrick. The guard stood at the door, his weapon resting at an angle, his visor reflecting the room in miniature. Jedrick waited until their footsteps faded, then leaned back in his chair, speaking in a conversational tone. He asked the guard if he had ever tried fermented honey. The guard didn't answer, but Jedrick kept talking, describing the taste, the way it clung to your tongue, the way the scent could fill a room and make your head swim. He mentioned the jar in his sack and how a man could open it without much trouble if he knew how to use his elbows and knees. The guard shifted slightly, still silent. Jedrick let his voice grow lazier, like a man drifting toward sleep, until the guard glanced toward him. That was the moment Jedrick swung both legs up, kicked the table into the guard's knees, and lunged forward. The guard stumbled, his weapon clattering against the floor. Jedrick grabbed it between his forearms, awkward but firm enough to swing the butt into the guard's helmet. The man dropped, and Jedrick wasted no time in moving to the door. The hallway outside was empty. He kept low, the weapon awkward in his grip, and moved toward where he thought the containment chamber had been. The ship gave another lurch, and he guessed someone, or something, was giving the slavers more trouble than expected. He found the guarded door again, now with only one sentry, the other likely called away. He barreled into the man before he could react, knocking them both into the wall. The weapon slipped from his grip, but his shoulder and weight did enough to stun the guard. Jedrick kicked the weapon away, then turned to the door's panel. With his broken hands he couldn't work the controls precisely, but he remembered the rhythm of Krax's code. He pressed at the panel with his elbows. The little ship bucked like an unbroken colt as it tore away from the flagship, the controls slick under Jedrick's forearms, and the cabin thrumming with a sound that reminded him of bees on a hot noon. Buga crouched in the cargo bay behind him, too big for the space, her breath a steady engine of its own. Through the cockpit glass he saw the wide dark over the fields and the thin strings of road light, and beyond that the bruised glow of the town. A streak of white clipped across the left pane as a pursuing craft peeled out from the flagship's hangar, followed by another and another, a neat formation that spoke of training and a faith in procedures that made Jedrick itch. He shoved the throttle with his elbow. The ship responded with an offended howl and leapt forward. The first pursuer spat a beam that slid past his starboard in a hiss of heated air. He did not need hands to curse with focus, so he did, and the words seemed to help the ship find a little more speed. Buga called up from the bay in her gravelly voice to ask if he had any of the honey left, which would have been a peculiar question anywhere but here. He told her there was a small jar wedged under the seat for courage, and she said that would do. When a bear tells you a jar of courage will do, you do not argue. He wedged the controls with his knee, wriggled the jar free, smashed the lid on the console edge, and sloshed the thick, fermented syrup into the intake vents along the cabin floor. The smell rose like a summer storm breaking over a bakery. A heartbeat later the little ship coughed, sputtered, and then, to his surprise, smoothed out as if the engines had discovered a taste for rebellion. Behind them, one of the pursuing craft drifted sideways as if drunk, then fishtailed and dropped behind the line. Buga laughed, an alarming sound in a confined space, and told him to keep flying like a crooked rabbit. If he zigged where a man should zag, their training would chase ghosts. They skimmed the treetops, branches whipping past so close Jedrick could identify species by silhouette. Floodlights from the smaller slaver ships raked the ground in pale blades. The farm showed ahead not as he had left it but as a thing mid-recovery, the barn doors askew, the yard trammeled, smoke from the fireworks clinging low as fog. As he brought the ship over the yard, he saw movement at the fence line and felt a knot loosen in his chest. Neighbors had not scattered. A few waved their tools at the sky, which is not how tools are meant to be used, but the gesture made something bright stir under his ribs. He dropped the ship hard, skidding it along the front pasture and letting the belly chew a furrow through the ruined potato row. The pursuers overshot, circled, and began to angle in for a coordinated pass. Buga punched the cargo hatch control with a paw and dropped into the yard with the pleased thump of a promise kept. Neighbors surged to meet her, then surged back because they were not foolish. Jedrick stumbled out of the cockpit, every nerve alive, his hands angry stones at the ends of his arms. He shouted that they needed light and smoke and a path clear to the barn because the barn held more than lumber. Mara met him halfway with a lantern and a question he barely heard. He told her the truth as it had finally sharpened inside him during the escape. Krax had not come for pigs or hens or even honey. He had come for a map he believed was hidden somewhere on this land. Not a paper map, not a carving in the rafters, but a living map encoded in the yeast colonies of the fermented honey, a star chart smuggled across generations by people who pretended they had nothing but recipes and patience. The shape of the bubbles, the regular way the fermentation laddered upward, the ratio of sweet to sour over time, all of it was a language. Jedric's mother had babied that culture like a 10th child and told him never to let it die. He had thought it was just a family quirk. Cracks, it turned out, kept better notes than family legends did. Mara said that if a map wanted to hide in the kitchen, it had the right, and then she asked what they were going to do about the ships that were currently trying to erase the kitchen altogether. The answer arrived as the first beam cut across the yard and sizzled through the pump handle, sending steam into the air like an angry ghost. Buga roared and leapt straight up, catching the landing strut of the nearest craft with both paws and yanking. The ship wobbled, dipped, and smacked into the yard with a metallic whine. Neighbors swarmed it with ropes and a tractor chain, farm solutions to sky problems. Jedric ran for the barn, legs operating on the stubborn credit of a man who has promised his own stew a timely return. Inside the barn the air held that warm animal scent he had loved since boyhood, now layered with the sharp tang of slaver metal and the sweet sour breath of honey. He shoved aside sacks with his shoulder, and kicked the trapdoor to the cellar open with his boot. The old blue barrel waited in the cool below, half full now, but enough. He leaned over it, inhaled deep like a man reading a letter written to his heart, and the scent told him a story of points and paths, of vectors caught in sugar, of a route someone once took away from a place where no one should have to live. Footsteps scraped behind him, light and precise. He turned to see Cracks step through the barn doors as if entering a conservatory. His sash had acquired a smear of honest dirt, and he looked personally offended by this. He told Jedric that it had been a delightful performance so far, but that the curtain call had arrived, and he would very much like to conclude business. Jedric said that if business meant stealing family heirlooms disguised as pantry goods, he would have to be a rude host. Cracks's eyes flicked toward the cellar. He said he would be taking the barrel and the culture within it, and also the farmer, who had shown an unusual aptitude for causing inconvenience. He offered assurances that the neighbors would be left unmolested if both items came quietly. Jedric took one step toward the stairs and then 2 steps sideways, because a sideways step is how you start a dance when you do not want to lead. Cracks moved with him, elegant as a cat on a church railing. Outside, Buga hit something large and metal struck wood, and someone laughed in that terrifying way people do when fear turns to fuel. Jedric told Cracks that he had learned a trick or two since yesterday, and then he did the impolite thing. He threw himself down the cellar steps shoulder first, hit the barrel with enough force to rock it hard, and shouted for Buga with a voice that reached the roof. Cracks swore, finally losing a bit of gloss, and came after him with a weapon that hummed like a nest of hornets. Jedric rolled, caught the barrel with his knee, and tipped it. The blue wave came like a slow, unstoppable tide. The cellar floor turned into a swamp of sweet and slick. Cracks's boot hit the honey and moved forward about 8 inches further than it intended to. He pinwheeled once in a movement so precise it looked choreographed, and then he recovered, because of course he did. He leveled the weapon. He